Okay, so what we're doing here today is explaining a Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, and I have Lori here with me who's going to pretend to be my buyer, and we're going to sit down and talk about what it looks like to explain the North Carolina Working with Real Estate Agent brochure to a potential buyer. So, Lori, thank you so much for coming to my office today and meeting. I'm very excited about going to look at homes with you. Are you excited?
Yes, very.
Wonderful. Well, before we get started, and before we even get in the car or even start looking at homes on the MLS, what I need to do is go over what's called a Working with Real Estate Agents brochure with you. Okay, now first thing I want to point out here, if you'll look, I'm going to circle this. It says this is not a contract. Okay, that's very important for you to know because what you sign here today is not going to obligate you to anything. This is only going to be signed to acknowledge that I've given you a copy of this, because the North Carolina Real Estate Commission says that it's my job to make sure that you're informed before we have any substantial kind of conversation with each other about your finances, your motivation for buying a home, or anything personal, right down to your kids and your dog. Okay, is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. So let me just give you a little bit of history about what buyer agency is. So back in 1993, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission decided that it was a very good idea for buyers to have representation, because prior to that, if you were a buyer and you walked into a real estate firm or you called a realtor up on the phone and you wanted to go out and look at a home, guess who that realtor represented? The seller. Exactly. So even if they had never met the seller before, they were considered what was called a seller subagent. Okay, so they didn't have to meet the seller in order to be representing them. So what that means is any personal information that you would disclose to them, they're obligated to let that seller know that information. That's kind of not very fair. So North Carolina was one of the very first states to adopt buyer agency agreement, which is fabulous because it protects you as a consumer. Okay, so what North Carolina said that we should do is to explain to you the different types of agency that are available. Okay, and the first one, since you're a buyer, we're going to talk about is a buyer's agent. Now, what this brochure will go over is some of the different duties that I'm responsible to you for. Once you sign a written exclusive buyer agency agreement with me, I am now legally bound to you. Okay, so that means that I have to do everything in your best interest. I'm going to handle all of the monies and the accounting and everything that goes on. I'm going to find out the material facts about any home that you have questions about that may or may not affect your decision to write an offer on that home or to proceed with closing. Once you do contract on a home, what we're going to do is do a home inspection, and we're going to do a lot of due diligence in making sure that that home meets your requirements inside and out, not just, homes are really great when you first go look at them, and sometimes you can find that there's hidden things in there. And I'm not a licensed home inspector, so just walking into a home, I couldn't tell you if there was a problem with the foundation, for example. But it is my job to make sure that I put you in contact with those people that can. Okay, so it's also my job to be incredibly loyal to you. That means you can rest assured while we're out talking in homes, while we're out looking at homes, while we're on the phone, while we're sending emails to each other, none of your personal information is ever going to be shared with anybody. I can actually get in a lot of trouble for sharing client information once I have a signed agency agreement with them. And I really like my job, and I don't want to lose my job. So I'm going to make sure that all of your information is kept private. Fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it is my job also to tell you that if you do not sign a buyer agency agreement, anything and everything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No, I'm sorry, not in a court of law, in a real estate negotiation. Okay, and the reason for that is because there is something called seller's agent working with a buyer, which talks right about here. Now, remember how I told you earlier, prior to 1993, there was something called there was only seller sub agency that existed. Well, if we were to go out and look at homes, and we did not have an exclusive buyer agency agreement that both you and I sign, I technically work for the seller. Doesn't matter what home we look at, doesn't matter what company that home is listed with, I work for the seller. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so what I like to do before we look at homes is to sit down and go over the exclusive buyer agency agreement with you, which we will do as soon as we're finished with that. That is a contract. That binds me to you. Okay, so Even if we want to sign it for a day, if we want to sign it for a week, or if we want to sign it for a few months, you can rest assured that with a buyer agency agreement, nothing that you say to me is ever going to be shared with anybody. I know I've said that before, but I just want to make sure you understand that. Fair? Okay. All right. So let's talk about services as a buyer's agent. So let's talk about the services and the compensation, which are right there. Okay. So whether or not we have a written agreement or we don't have a written agreement, I don't do this for free. Okay, so I don't charge my buyers a commission. What we do around here in our local area is the seller sits down with their listing agent before they put their home on the market, and they determine what fee that is going to be charged. It's usually a percentage of the purchase price of the home, whatever the house contracts for, appraises for, and actually sells for. Out of the seller's proceeds comes that percentage right off the top, and the listing agreement indicates that there is a percentage of that percentage that will be shared out to any buyer's agent, whether it's somebody within their same firm or whether it's another buyer agent who has a license with another firm. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so you never pay my commission. However, I'm working for you when we sign that exclusive buyer agency agreement.
Okay.
Kind of cool, huh? You get free services and you get all the legal representation that you could ever want. And
sounds like a good deal.
Absolutely. And I'm basically yours from beginning to end and even after the transaction is closed. I will always be your realtor forever and for always until you decide that you don't want to work with me anymore. Now, let me also say this about buyer agency agreements. It's not a contract that's going to completely bind you to me forever. If at any time you feel that I'm not working in your best interest, or if you feel just uncomfortable with working with me, or if I'm not showing you the homes that you want to look at, or you just get a bad feeling, I will be happy to sit down and do a termination of agency agreement. I have a good reputation in this town, and I want to keep it that way, and I never want to do anything that's going to make somebody feel uncomfortable or make somebody feel like they're required to work with me. My time is important. You're more important to me as my client. Fair enough?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So, you don't have to pay for my services. Somebody else pays for them. That's a good thing. So let's talk about what happens in a dual agency situation. Okay, now, that's kind of a crazy term, isn't it? Dual agent. Sounds like it could get kind of complicated.
Yeah.
It really doesn't have to. What dual agency is if any listing that you want to go look at that is listed by any agent in our firm, not just me, it could be Susie or John or Tammy or any of those agents here that have great listings that are a great deal and you're just ready to go put an offer on it. Well, if I show you those homes and we're under a buyer agency agreement, guess what? The firm has confidential information about that seller. I can't give you any information about that seller because we have a seller's agency agreement with them, which we'll go over here in a minute. Okay? So we've promised to that seller that we're not going to tell any potential buyers any information about them. Just like we've promised to you under signing an exclusive buyer agency agreement that we're not going to share any of your information with that seller. So what do we do in a contract and negotiation situation? Okay, so what happens? Let's pretend you write an offer on one of my listings or one of the listings that's listed by this firm here. And you come to me and say, hey, Heidi, I really like 123 Main Street that we saw yesterday. I'm ready to put an offer in. I'm just not certain that I'm comfortable with the $150,000 asking price that they're asking for. How much do you think that I should put an offer in for? At this point, I cannot help you with the negotiation piece. At this point, I have to say, we also represent the seller, so you're going to have to decide what you want to do with this offer. You're going to have to decide how much closing costs you want to ask for. You're going to have to decide all of that stuff on your own. So what I like to do while we're going over this exclusive buyer agency agreement that we're about to go over is I like to sit down and educate you about the process of writing an offer before we even go look at any homes. And the reason for that is if we do end up in a dual agency situation, I want you to know that there are options, but I can't help you make those exact decisions. I can only show you homes that have sold recently on the market, but I cannot give you any indication of what your best offer should be. Okay, so we're going to go over how to do all of that. And the same thing, if you were my seller and the buyer were to come in and put an offer on your home and that buyer was working with an agent in our firm or was working with me, and you came to me and said, hey, Heidi, we got this offer for $150,000 and gosh, it's $10,000 lower than what we're asking for. What should I do? At that point, I have to remind you, we're in a dual agency situation. I can't help you with the negotiations of this piece. Okay, so that's the only thing that dual agency really kind of limits me from being able to help you with. But I promise you, I'm going to give you all of the education and information that you need prior to even going to look at homes, so that you can make, no matter what kind of situation we get in with the home that you decide on, you're going to have the best educated information to decide what your best offer should be. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And I will tell you, I've been doing this a long time, and I've never once had a problem with dual agency, and I have done a lot of dual agencies before. So, let's talk about seller agency. Very similar to buyer agency, only in this case, the seller signs an exclusive right to sell listing agreement, giving the agent the authority to represent them in the transaction, to market their home, to put a key box on their home and a sign in the yard, to work over a seller net sheet with them. So when it does come time for you to sell this home that you're buying one day, you're going to come back to me and we're going to talk about how much you owe on the house, how many potential closing costs there could be, what the commission on that you would pay out would be. And we're going to do a seller net sheet that would show what your bottom line would be. Sometimes that helps sellers determine how much they want to put their home on the market for, and then they compare it to what market value is. So if there's a proceeds check that they're going to get at the end of the closing, or if there is a deficit and that they owe more on the house than what they would receive back. So we get into really personal financial information and motivation for selling with listing agreements. That's one of the reasons it's so important to keep that confidentiality between agent and client, so that seller never has to have their position compromised to be able to negotiate a contract.
Sure.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So the thing about a listing agreement, or the thing about seller agency, is any information that a seller would sit down and share with a potential agent that they're interviewing, until they sign that listing agreement, any of that information is up for grabs. So let's say you're in a situation where you're selling your home and you're interviewing 5 agents. I hope you're not having to interview 5 agents, but let's just pretend that you are. And you were to sit down in front of the first agent and you just told them all about, your family history and, the financial trouble that you're in, or maybe that you've got $100,000 in the bank that you could use to fix up the property, but you really don't want to because you want to keep that $100,000 in the bank to buy, I don't know, a new BMW, who knows. If you don't sign that listing agreement with that agent that you've given all of that information to, and that agent comes back later and has a buyer for that house, guess what that agent has to tell their buyer, who they have an exclusive buyer agency agreement with? They have to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, guess what? I met with this person, like 3 weeks ago, and they just disclosed all of this personal information to me, but they never signed the listing agreement with me. So guess what? I get to tell all of this to you now, so you can make an offer on this house based on the information that they gave me. Maybe we can ask for $50,000 worth of repairs or upgrades or whatever. That doesn't mean you're going to get it. But as a seller, would you want that information disclosed to somebody who may potentially be bringing you an offer?
No.
Absolutely not. That's why it's so important for buyers and sellers, when an agent sits down with them at the table or, at the beginning of a listing, to go over this Working with Real Estate Agents brochure before they talk about any substantial information that may affect their ability to negotiate a contract. Because if you're not going to sign a listing agreement with me, or you're not going to sign a buyer agency agreement with me, it's really important for you to know all of this, that if you don't, everything you've just shared with me, it's going to somebody else. And I don't like to work that way. So that's why we go over this Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, to make sure that you're protected, to make sure that you're well educated, and that you never get yourself into a position where you feel like somebody has done you wrong. Okay, so let's just kind of recap here. We've talked about buyer agency. We've talked about my duties to you as a buyer. We've gone over unwritten agreements a little bit. Actually, I think we kind of skipped over that. So let me just talk to you about unwritten agreements. Something called oral buyer agency basically just says, you tell me I don't want to sign a buyer agency agreement with you right now, but I'm going to tell you, hey, you know what? I'm going to keep your information private, and we're going to go out and look at homes, and then when you're ready to write an offer, we're going to put everything in writing and actually sign a buyer agency agreement. I'll tell you right now, I don't like to do that because I don't like for there to be any question, cause for concern with any way, shape, or form that any of your personal information is going to be shared with me. My time is important, your time is important, and your information and your transaction is very important, and it should be all kept confidential. That's why we're going to put everything in writing. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. We'll go over that. We've talked about services and compensation, and we've also talked about your right to terminate a buyer agency agreement if you want. We've discussed dual agency. Do you have any questions or concerns about dual agency whatsoever?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, gotcha. One other thing I want to make sure that I mention, whether you're doing, whether we find ourselves in a buyer agency situation, dual agent situation, seller working with a buyer situation, or a seller's a seller's agent situation. I totally lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know where that went. No, totally lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. I completely went off in left field. So I really had a point that I was trying to make. But anyway, you said you had no questions about any of this. And if at any time you feel uncomfortable, please come to me and we'll talk about that. And now we're going to move on to the buyer agency.
Okay.
Is that okay?
All right.
All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and stop this.